because it's 2015, I don't think any of us can forget what the answer was of Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in 2015 when he was asked why parity was so important to him when forming the first gender-equal Canadian government in Canadian history. And that was after 2013, when exactly half of the provincial premiers were already women, although just for a short time, for a couple of months. At the next election, in 2019, a lot of Canadian women, if I'm right, said that, let's say, gender parity this time is not because it's 2019, but because there's competence. I wonder if I got that all right. We're going to have the right person to answer all those questions. And I'm also personally very interested if there really is such a thing now in the Canadian government that they officially call a feminist response to COVID-19 pandemic due to the fact that it has disproportionately affected women and girls. Our next speaker is Carolyn Charette, Canada's ambassador to Hungary and also to Slovenia and Bosnia-Herzegovina. And she's been all over the world. Her first posting was in Japan, later she lived in New Delhi, then in Paris, and today, besides Hungary, I told you a couple of more countries. She likes to ride her bike a lot. And believe it or not, but there was a time when she still worked in Canada when she was ice skating to Parliament through some canal, some waterway, to get to work. Please welcome Her Excellency, Canada's ambassador to Hungary.
I think I'm going to need a microphone. Can I use one of those?
Yes, of course. Thank you.
Hello. I do have a strong voice, but I think it's going to be easier this way. Jó napot kívánok! Bocsánat, nem beszélek magyarul. That is unfortunately the extent of my ability to speak your wonderful language, and I hope you will pardon me for making this presentation in English today. Well, it's a pleasure to be here and to address this audience. And I'm very grateful to Edina for inviting me today to share some of the Canadian experience on women's rights and leadership. So the first time I met Edina, she gave me this 864 bill, which represents the salary of a woman compared to that of a man for the same work. And I found that the image was extremely powerful. It really drove the message of the need to ensure equality of right, doesn't it? And I must say that I find it sad to think that today in 2022, this is still our reality, because we all think that we've made so much progress, but in fact, there is a lot left to be made. So before I start my presentation, I just want to pause a moment to recognize the absolutely horrible war that is taking place in Ukraine. And I want to pay tribute especially to the women of Ukraine who are showing such strength and resilience and inspiring us in the face of all the horror they are facing. I find their courage to be remarkable and an inspiration, and it should inspire all to fight, because they are fighting for their life, for their rights, and for their family. So just want to pay them a tribute this morning. Okay, so we want to talk a little bit about Canadian experience when it comes to women's rights and empowerment, but I'll start by talking a little bit, not too much, about myself, where I come from, and how this has forged me into who I am today. So my name is Carolyn Charette. As Christina said, I'm the Canadian ambassador to Hungary, Slovenia, and Bosnia-Herzegovina. I was nominated in this position in 2019 after having spent about 20 years as a career diplomat with the Canadian Foreign Service. I come from the French part of Canada, the province of Quebec. Maybe you can hear it in my accent a little bit. And more specifically, I was born and raised on the outskirts of Montreal. I was raised in the 70s in a relatively modest family with very traditional values and a very strong Catholic tradition. But even though we had this tradition and this culture in the 70s and in the 80s, the emancipation of women, we used to use this word a lot, emancipation of women, was such a key element of the society. And it was reflected in the education and received from my mother, from my teacher, from other women I could see around me and the role models. I think that the women where I come from were very strong and really ready to voice the need to have their rights to equality be recognized. And this fight for rights had started, of course, earlier in Canada at the beginning of the 20th century with the fight for the right to vote, which had an interesting history because in 1916, some provinces started giving the right to vote to women, and then the federal level in 1917, I think. But then in Quebec, in the province where I'm from, it came only in 1940. And for Indigenous women in Canada, the right to vote at the federal level was granted to them in 1960. So they were not recognized as having full rights as an equal, as a member of the society, because they were women and because they were Indigenous. But by the 1980s, when I was, a teenager and becoming an adult and going on, like finishing high school, what I saw was that the progress had been phenomenal. Women had acquired what we thought was equal status to men in most laws. There were some, at that time we called it positive discrimination programs, affirmative action policies that were in place to give equal access to education, to jobs in the public service. You could see more and more women in the public sphere and political and in the media. We had a Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms that was integrated in our Constitution in 1982 by the then Prime Minister Trudeau, the father of the current Prime Minister. And the Charter said, every individual is equal before and under the law and has the right to the equal protection and equal benefit of the law without discrimination, and in particular, without discrimination based on race, national or ethnic origin, color, religion, sex, age, or mental or physical disability. And later on, this definition was extended by the court to include gender rights. And I remember having a poster in my room as a teenager with the Charter of Rights and Freedom because we were very, very proud of having integrated that into our society, and it was very progressive. And I could see my mother, my aunts, the women around me, they were living like their best life. They had interesting careers. And the message I was receiving is that the fact that I was a woman didn't make any difference, that I could do everything I want, that I was living in a equalitarian society that had recognized my right as a woman. So I went on to study first as a journalist, and then I went into law school. And I thought I had the world ahead of me and nothing was gonna save me. The battle for equal right had been won, and I was gonna take on the world. I did not feel any need to claim my rights, like being a feminist was not a thing. I mean, who needs to be a feminist? What does it mean? It was like seen as something very adversarial. We were free to make the choices we wanted. And then everything came to a halt very suddenly. It was on December 6, 1989. I remember I was 19 years old. And there's a man, I don't know if I want to pronounce his name, yeah. His name was Marc Lépine, and he walked into Polytechnic School in Montreal, which was the prestigious engineering school, and he killed 14 women with a gun. "14 young, brilliant students who were going to be fantastic engineers. One of them was from my hometown. We used to sing at the church choir together. And they were killed only because they were women. They were killed because there's a man who thought they were taking his place in society." So maybe I had been naive. I think I had been. I think we all had been thinking that we had achieved equality. And after all, I had so little experience in life. But for many young women, and probably also many not so young and with more experience, that was the moment we realized in my little community, in my province, in my country, that there was a lot of work left to achieve full equality and to ensure that women effectively had the same right as men, including the right to live. Now, that's a very dramatic story and a bit of a shocking one. The reason I chose to speak about that experience is because I think sometimes we need events like this. We need like watershed moment like this to realize that we are being complacent vis-a-vis a situation. We are comfortable in our life, in our journey. We don't want to rock the boat too much. We think, sure, discrimination exists, but I'm fine. It doesn't affect me. It affects other people, but not me, so why should I bother? Or we think, oh, you know, after all those affirmative action programs, maybe, you know, they give priority to some people who don't really merit it. You'd be surprised, I heard it from the mouth of an ambassador last week at a dinner, and he said, yeah, you know, but women, you know, if they join the foreign service, then they go on to have kids. They cannot do the same work as men. And I was at that dinner, and I was pinching myself, thinking, I'm not going to say from which country, but thinking, I can't believe I'm hearing this today in 2022. So what I'd like to do today is to take this opportunity to remind us collectively of why it's important to ensure that we have full representation of women and other underrepresented groups in all areas of our life. I could go and give you a list of studies and economic factor, but I had so much in the notes that I received to prepare this speech, but I kept a few or two that I think are especially telling. The McKinsey Global Institute estimated in 2015 that achieving gender equality around the world could increase the total GDP by 12 trillion over 10 years. That's a lot of wealth. That's a lot of productivity. That's a lot of quality of life that can be created by achieving gender equality, that everybody would benefit. And I want to talk another more technical point is on representation. Women's representation in government in my line of business has increased tremendously. Christina was mentioning because it's 2015 and the parity, I had it in my speech too. I'll skip that paragraph now that you know it. But women head of state around the world, between 2005 and 2019, went from 8 to 20 women head of state out of 200 and something. I think that's 10%. It's not even 10%. So it's increasing, but there's a lot of work to do. And the global average of women members of parliament went from 16 to 24% over the same period. So barely 24% of representation in our legislature. The people who make the laws, who decide for you what is going to be the society in which you raise your family, the society in which you work, in which you progress. And so the 2015, you know, the first parity cabinet in Canadian government with 50% women, 50% men, named by Prime Minister Trudeau when he got his famous sentence, because it's, why are you doing that? Because it's 2015, was also a cabinet that had a very broad representation. We had a refugee as Minister of parliamentary institution reforms. We had a blind Paralympic athlete as Minister of Sport and Youth. We had an Indigenous woman as Minister of Justice. Now she's no longer in cabinet. That was a bit complicated, but there was real representativity. We had a man of Indian Sikh origin wearing a turban, former Canadian veteran of the war in Afghanistan, as defense minister. I mean, you could look at this cabinet and it was a real representation of our society. Further on, the Prime Minister went on and made a commitment that ambassadors, Canadian ambassadors abroad, would be representative. In 2018, we had the first diplomatic representation that was at parity. 50% of our ambassadors, more or less, are women. My colleague, who's our ambassador in Prague, is a Canadian of Indian origin, one of the first women of color to be named Canadian ambassador in a European country. We've ensured that this face that we show to the world represents our society. Not to say that there's not a lot of work left to do in many spheres of public life. For example, in our Canadian force, we've pledged to increase by 1% every year the representation of women, with a goal of achieving 25% representation by 2026, which is above the NATO average, but it's not achieved yet. It's a challenging goal, but it's an important one, especially in an organization like the Canadian Force, if we want to ensure that we address the discrimination, systemic discrimination that still exists in the armed force, and ensure that women can fully contribute to peace and security around the world. Beyond the numbers and the need for, you know, basic equality principle, I want to say a few words in conclusion about the importance of diversity and inclusion and how we look at it in Canada. This touches not only on women, but any underrepresented group or group facing systemic discrimination. So we like to say that diversity is a fact, but inclusion is a choice. So it's not easy to build inclusive policies in your organization, be it a business or a government. And the solution that are required need us to be very committed, very strategic, and for us as leaders to actively promote a culture of inclusion, because it does not come naturally all the time, and a high respect for diversity. In Canada, we've made the strategic choice to realize the benefit, the tangible benefit of this diversity. And our promotion of inclusion and respect for diversity is an expression of our values and a practical approach to advance our national interests. This is our differentiation. This is where we want to share with the world how we articulate those values. And we have come to learn that our diversity is actually a great source of creativity, of resilience and strength. Canada's diversity makes us richer in every sense. I said earlier, diversity is a fact, but inclusion is a choice. So inclusion for us is the right thing to do and the smart thing to do. But it's not always the easy thing to do. it's only when government and citizens really choose this path of inclusion, either economic, social, cultural, or democratic, that all those benefits can be fully realized. Exclusion, on the other end, will diminish us all. Those excluded have to bear the heavy burden of exclusion. They cannot achieve their full potential, their full participation. You remember this McKinsey statistics that I said if we reach gender equality, we'll increase world GDP by so much. And I think this can be extended to all groups that are excluded and do not participate fully in society. So that's why we in Canada, and me as a Canadian ambassador in my mandate, I have to work to promote inclusion and respect for diversity, because we think it's a proven path for peace, prosperity, respect of human rights. And building greater inclusion is challenging. It requires fresh solution. No one has all the answers. There's no perfect model to copy. But we will continue to learn from others, collaborate with those who are working to promote inclusion and respect for diversity. So let me conclude by quoting a Canadian politician. Her name was Rosemary Brown. She's a Jamaican immigrant, and she was the first Black woman elected to a Canadian parliament. And she said many decades ago, until all of us have made it, none of us has made it. So if we're going to make it, we have to do it together. Thank you. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.